Among the 100-plus people that Donald Trump granted clemency to during his final hours in office, a fact that I had a sort of memory hold a little bit, to be honest, was his one-time campaign chairman, later White House advisor Steve Bannon. Now, Bannon was arrested by federal agents back in the summer of 2020, accused of defrauding Trump supporters. These are diehard Trump-loving donors, defrauding them out of millions of dollars. Donors believed they were giving money towards the construction of a wall along the Mexican border to fulfill the promise that Trump had not. And the money didn't do that. But then Trump came along, wiped Bannon's charges away with a stroke of the pen, as he is empowered to do by the U.S. Constitution, clearing the way for Bannon to take on a new role, which was key sponsor of Trump's attempted coup. Or at least he was doing that while Trump was preparing to wipe it away. Now, Bannon may be back in legal jeopardy, reportedly for the same crime, this time under a state indictment, New York State, by the Manhattan District Attorney. According to the Washington Post, quote, the precise details of the state case could not be confirmed, but people familiar with the situation suggest the prosecution will likely mirror aspects of the federal case in which he was pardoned. In a statement, Bannon said the district attorney was pursuing, quote, phony charges, adding, I have not yet begun to fight. But just a short time ago, CNBC got word from Bannon's lawyer that he was, quote, en route to surrender. Lots of questions about what we're expecting to play out tomorrow. I'm glad to have two experts with me at the table to talk about it. Rebecca Roife is a former Manhattan district attorney, and Charles Coleman is a former Brooklyn assistant district attorney, and they both join me now. It's good to have you both here. Rebecca, let me start with you as someone who worked as assistant district attorney in Manhattan, which I think is going to be prosecuting this case. The big question here is double jeopardy, right? The Constitution bars you being tried twice for the same crime. Obviously, there's different jurisdictions. What is the constitutional lay of the land about the feasibility of this prosecution?
Right. So I think the legal issues are not as complicated as they were, for instance, when Paul Manafort faced charges in federal court and state court. First of all, because Steve Bannon wasn't actually convicted. He was pardoned before he was convicted in federal court. And second of all, because the law in New York has subsequently changed, basically closing up a loophole that New York had previously created for somebody who had been pardoned and using that for double jeopardy. So normally a state and a federal charge wouldn't be considered double jeopardy, but New York had fairly strong laws that suggested that it would. Now they don't have those same laws.
In terms of the strength of the case, there were two other people that were arrested and tried by the federal government, the Department of Justice, for their role in this scheme. Both of them have pleaded guilty, which, you know, if I were Bannon, that would not augur well for me, I would imagine.
Absolutely, Chris. You know, prosecutors are among the most underappreciated and maligned group of public servants. And Alvin Bragg was in the public eye, if you recall, a while back when the Donald Trump investigation cooled. And he was taking a lot of heat, some of them from his own ADAs, about not continuing with the investigation. What we're seeing here is the fact that DA Bragg understands there are multiple routes to justice. And what he's doing in this case is going after, in a very strong way, people who are associated with Trump for things that they did. And he's holding them accountable. The fact that there were two other people connected to this case who were convicted is clear evidence, if you will, that there's a strong case and that there's something there. Where there's smoke, there's fire. And so regardless of the public persona and the posturing that Steve Bannon is actually doing in public, he has to understand that he's facing a very serious uphill legal battle with respect to these potential charges. It's very weird to me, his posture. I mean, obviously, I think he thinks it's good for his bottom line. I don't know if anyone's told him that you can't podcast in prison, and they only give you one shirt, not two. But, you know, he's already facing, like, the possibility of time in prison for his conviction in criminal contempt, where he refused. I mean, he could have gone in and just said fifth, like Michael Flynn did. He could have tried to, like, litigate something. But he basically just said, like, go take a long walk off a short pier to Congress, and he was convicted by a jury of his peers. He's now facing sentencing for that, right?
Yeah, completely. And I mean, I think part of what's happening here is that there's a political battle to be won and there's a legal battle to be won. And these people are fighting the political battle and ignoring the legal battle, potentially because the legal battle is one that they are not going to win. He is just, you know, dead to words there. And so he's essentially trying to play this in the public, but ultimately he's going to have to face a judge and a jury, and, you know, whatever he's doing in public isn't going to work for him anymore.
But, Chris, if I may, on that point, a big part of the Trump playbook and anyone associated with him, particularly Steve Bannon, is narrative control.
Yeah,
because
right.
They know that with respect to mainstream media, if you will, their supporters, their followers, they're not following that.
Right.
They're getting information straight from them. And so the idea of being able to control this public narrative and say, look, this is the weaponized justice system that has been politicized for 60 days before the election, it's right out of their playbook.
Right. And I think, I mean, what's weird about this is, and again, I don't really care one way or the other about what Steve Bannon's fate is, but, yes, I mean, I think it's probably, he issued this preposterous statement that looked like it was like written by a Bond villain or something. It just seems to me that, right, you could probably raise a bunch of money off your devoted podcast fan base, but at a certain point, like, that's not going to work. Like, Steve Bannon, like, I don't think you really want to go to jail in New York State.
Right.
Am I wrong? I don't know. Maybe he really does, but I don't think you do.
Right. I mean, I think that there's just a complete denial of what this is actually doing. And I also think that narrative about the, weaponization of the of prosecution is working less and less. And this is the bread and butter of a local DA's office. This is a straightforward fraud case. And so it becomes harder and harder to claim that this is politically motivated when what you're accused of doing is just theft.
Also, I mean, we should note the victims here are ardent, diehard Trump supporters who gave money to an organization called We Build the Wall.
Right.
Another legal development today I wanted to get you guys just your thoughts on. This involves a federal investigation, of course, federal criminal investigation. We know that there's a grand jury in Washington, D.C. It's investigating January 6th. We know some of the people that have come before to testify, including Mark Short, Chief of Staff of Mike Pence. We know that Pat Cipollone came last week, of course, the president's. Today we got this interesting kind of incremental development in the New York Times that FBI agents in Florida tried to interview William S. Russell, who served as a special assistant and the deputy director of DeVance in the White House and continued to work for Mr. Trump as a personal aide after he left office. Now, this is someone who isn't as high on the org chart as the White House counsel, but presumably is someone who's like very close and around Donald Trump all the time. What do you think of that?
I think that for prosecutors, for investigators, for the committee, it is a win-win. And it's a win-win because you're not going to have the barriers and the obstacles of executive privilege or attorney-client privilege that have held up some of the questioning with respect to the committee and the investigation in the past. This is someone who doesn't have a privilege but has all the information because they were just as close to Donald Trump as anyone else. So they can talk about what he knew, they can talk about what he said, they can talk about what he did, and there is no barrier to prevent them from giving that information.
I hadn't thought about that. That's interesting.
I think that's right. And I also think that, the people who have the most information are not always the people who are the highest up. I mean, there's a lot of ways.
Cassidy Hutchinson, who was not super high in the org chart.
And when you're a prosecutor, you can get really valuable pieces of information. And often it's connecting dots, but sometimes it's vital information for a prosecution that comes from somebody like a secretary.
I mean, I just don't. Look, I've said this before on the show. Probability. The odds of independent things happening, right? If to get two things to happen independently, right? Like it's greater odds. You multiply them. It's like the odds of just skating out of all of the various traps. Whether you're Bannon, who now has like staring down the barrel of sentencing on a criminal contempt and is now turning himself into a prosecution in New York State, or Donald Trump, who's facing like stolen documents he was in possession of and is also got this January 6th. Like both of them, I would not be feeling particularly confident.
As a lawyer, we are taught very, very seldom do we make predictions or strong predictions, but we were talking during the break and I feel very comfortable saying this. Steve Bannon is going to jail. One way
you really
or the
think
other.
that?
Yes, I do believe so.
Well, I mean, I think he's going to get sentenced in the contempt case either way. So
he's going to jail for something.
Yes, right, yeah.
Either it is going to be because of this contempt case as well as the case in Manhattan, or a combination of both. The options and the walls are just becoming so slim and closing in so fast that he really does not have any recourse from a legal place.
What do you think?
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I don't know where the fraud case is going to go. And with the fraud prosecution, you never want to take odds because there's always a question of intent. We don't know what they have. But if it was a strong federal case, then it's a strong state case. These are basically, it's the same conduct. They're overlapping laws. And so, I think that since the federal government felt confident about bringing these charges, I think it's probably likely that they have a pretty good case in Manhattan as well.
Yeah. You also wonder if Brian Colfash, who is the disabled vet who was implicated in this and who pleaded guilty and is going to be set to be sentenced in December, might be talking. Will be interesting to see that. Rebecca Roythe, Charles Coleman.